This is Caribbean News Desk. I'm Dennis Chabrol with your Wednesday edition. In the program, Jamaica defends right to deny entry to former Trinidad and Tobago coup leader. Ebola may be doing some good for U.S.-Cuba relations. Senior policymakers preparing to meet in Jamaica to discuss the state of the regional economy. And a Brazilian has found a way to make water from the air. Also in today's edition, Barbados turns back tanker with suspected Ebola carriers. Details coming up.
One people, one nation, facing the same destiny. So separated we are, as one let's come together. One market economy, Caribbean is how it should be. Let's support, carry on for Caribbean unity. It takes you, it takes me.
And now the details. Jamaica's National Security Minister Peter Bunting has defended the country's right to deny entry to Trinidadian Yasin Abu Bakr and sought to justify the cost of his deportation. Nearly $36,000 was spent on hiring a plane. The Jamaat al Muslimeen leader arrived in the country late last week and claimed to be visiting his daughter, who was a student at the Jamauca campus of the University of the Western Lees. But immigration officers denied him entry. Mr. Bunting told the House of Representatives that Jamaica was within its right under the revised Treaty of Chaugaramas to deny entry to the Trinidadian Muslimeen leader on the grounds of national security.
Mr. Speaker, in the judgment of this administration, Yasin Abu Bakr presents a genuine, present and sufficiently serious threat to our national security to prohibit his free entry to Jamaica.
The National Security Minister has faced criticism from some quarters, including the opposition Jamaica Labour Party, about the money spent to hire a private charter.
While the cost of Abu Bakr's removal by a private charter was significant, it pales in comparison to what the attempted coup d'etat cost Trinidad in 1990. It pales in comparison to what a terrorist incident would cost Jamaica today. It pales in comparison to the billions of dollars that the mishandling of the Christopher Coke extradition cost this country in 2010. I regard this expenditure the same way I do a home insurance policy. We regret having to pay the premium when nothing happens, but we are really happy to have that insurance in place when a hurricane hits.
Abu Bakr was placed on a private charter flight after he started behaving boisterously after being placed in the economy class of a Caribbean Airlines commercial flight. Caribbean Airlines officials said it was against regulations to transport a non-compliant passenger in first or business class. The outbreak of the deadly Ebola virus that has killed thousands of persons in West Africa is poised to trigger cooperation between the United States and Cuba in fighting the disease. The Spanish news agency Agencia EFE quotes a U.S. State Department official as saying that the U.S. is ready to cooperate with Cuba in the international fight against Ebola in West Africa. The official stressed the significant contribution made by Cuba in sending hundreds of doctors and health workers to Africa to battle the virus. Former Cuban President Fidel Castro offered his country's cooperation with Washington in combating the disease. On Monday, a State Department spokesperson did not rule out the possibility of talks on cooperation between the U.S. and Cuba, which have had no diplomatic relations in decades. The U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry has applauded efforts against Ebola by the Cuban authorities. Mr. Kerry has said that his State Department is communicating with all members of the international community, including Cuba, to participate in the global effort through multilateral channels such as the World Health Organization and diplomatic meetings. Barbados has prevented a tanker from berthing at Bridgetown because it was carrying 2 crew members with Ebola-like symptoms. The island's Minister of Tourism and International Transport, Richard Seeley, made the disclosure in Parliament Tuesday night. He did so to make the point that systems are working to prevent the virus from entering that tourism-dependent island.
Systems are working. There was a tanker in Noble Spirit that had when the protocols were tested, was actually denied entry into Barbados waters. There were 2 persons on board who had symptoms that were deemed to be Ebola-like, and on the basis of diverse protocols, port health, the port managers, the national security end of things, defense and security, immigration, etc., the office of the Prime Minister, we were able to say no thank you.
The minister did not say when the vessel was turned back. He said there was no reason for Barbados to follow several sister CARICOM countries in banning persons who would have traveled from the worst affected West African countries. An academic in the Dominican Republic supports the decision by several Caribbean countries to ban visitors from West Africa and countries affected by Ebola. Director of the Dominican Republic's Latin American College of Social Sciences, Ivan Ogando Lora, says the decision by the Caribbean countries is a measure of economic survival. Lora was quoted by the Spanish news agency Agencia EFE as saying that tourism is the backbone of the Caribbean economies. He says one suspected Ebola case in any part of the Caribbean will hurt tourism throughout the region. That, he says, will mean a reduction of its tourism industry de facto and maybe for all of the islands. He says the ban on visitors from Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Guinea is not an excessive or exaggerated measure because health systems and infrastructure in the region are either fragile or non-existent. Ogando Lora emphasizes that the Caribbean Public Health Agency and the Caribbean community are playing an important role in the economic security of the region by coordinating health policies to prevent the spread of the virus. So far, Jamaica, Guyana, Trinidad and Tobago, St. Lucia, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, St. Kitts and Nevis, and Antigua and Barbuda have established bans on visitors from certain countries in West Africa. The Ebola virus has killed more than 4,500 people over the last 10 months, mainly in Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Guinea, according to the latest figures from the World Health Organization. Senior government ministers are meeting in Montego Bay, Jamaica later this week to discuss ways to unlock economic growth in the Caribbean region. The meeting from the 23rd to 24th October, that's tomorrow and Friday, is being hosted by the International Monetary Fund and the Jamaican government. The issues to be discussed include the reliability and efficiency of energy provision and a tax regime to encourage investment and steps to strengthen the financial sector. Caribbean economies have been slow to recover from the global financial crisis. Bruce Edwards of the United Nations Radio reports.
Finance ministers and bank governors from across the Caribbean will meet in Jamaica this week for a high-level forum sponsored by the IMF. The theme is Unlocking Economic Growth, and participants include a wide cross-section of policymakers, economists, and high-level representatives of international institutions. Bert Van Selm is the IMF's representative in Jamaica.
It's an opportunity for discussion. By organizing these conferences, we try to bring everybody together to have a good dialogue about key issues in the region, in particular growth. Growth was a key issue in the first 2 conferences, and again at this conference, it's centrally on the agenda. How do we generate growth in the Caribbean? That's a question that is not so obvious to answer, and we need everybody's inputs here in coming up with good ideas and good solutions.
Joanne Creary-Johnson from the IMF's Communications Department traveled to Jamaica recently and talked to some of the participants in this year's conference. Hi, Joanne.
Hi, Bruce.
It seems that one of the challenges to growth in the Caribbean is the need for fiscal policies that might address debt and government spending issues. I understand Jamaica is moving forward on that front?
Yes, as a matter of fact, I met with Therese Turner-Jones, who is the country representative in Jamaica for the Inter-American Development Bank, the IDB. Therese is very encouraged by the adoption of a fiscal rule in Jamaica earlier this year.
Because as you know, that was sort of like the main thrust of my presentation in 2012 was what would help deal with the fiscal imbalances and the lack of fiscal discipline would be to entrench in policy some kind of rule. And so the law came into effect in April of this year, and so now the government is going through the process of putting in place all of the various regulations and making sure that the institutions are responsible for monitoring the fiscal rule. So I have a lot of hope for this upcoming conference, because now we're talking about the real issue, which is growth. The fact that the Caribbean has been slow to recover. Every policymaker working in the region is trying to deal with the fact that growth has been less than optimal.
Yes, and as you know, Joanne, the IMF's latest economic outlook for the region says growth has slowed more than expected in the Caribbean. You had a chance to meet the governor of the Bank of Jamaica. What does he think might come out of this conference?
Well, Governor Brian Winter, in fact, is pretty excited about hosting the conference in Jamaica. And he's looking forward, he told me, to discussing some important issues, including ensuring inclusive growth. But I started by asking him about the three key topics the conference will focus on: energy costs, reforming tax incentives, and the financial sector.
Well, I think, all of them represent areas where there are, certainly for Jamaica, where there have been major challenges. So addressing those, finding answers to those is important. I think that they also, for us, represent areas of tremendous opportunity, in the sense that if you know that you've got an energy cost that is much higher than it needs to be, then you can get improvements to, as I said earlier, general welfare, the economic growth and development of the country, from tackling those problems relatively quickly. But I would like to say a word for something that's not a specific topic of this conference, but as we look at that point of improving welfare, overall growth, if it's not inclusive, then given the kind of, I think, the way our communities work and our societies work, if you're not able to generate an inclusive path for this kind of growth, then you're going to establish the things that will threaten to undermine the very reforms that we're trying to put in place. Financial inclusion is something that the Caribbean, I think, needs to focus much more, and Jamaica does at least.
What are you hoping will come out of the upcoming high-level forum?
I think it's not the type of conference, in my view, where there is always an answer at the end of it that is the solution. What's useful, I think, is to have the ability to have this kind of high-level attention from the Caribbean. It's important that the individual needs of Caribbean countries get a chance to be heard in this kind of way, and hopefully it leads to change.
The governor of the Bank of Jamaica, Brian Winter, ending that report by the UN Radio's Bruce Edwards. And finally, a Brazilian engineer has designed a machine capable of producing 5,000 liters of drinking water a day by condensing humidity from the air and processing it to make it suitable for human consumption. Since 2010, Pedro Ricardo Paulino has sold 200 of his water-air devices introduced to the markets just as the southern Brazilian state of São Paulo entered a crisis due to sufficient water supplies. And that's today's edition of Caribbean News Desk. You can visit us online at caribnewsdesk.com or on our Facebook at facebook.com/Caribbean News Desk. If you wish to advertise on our program, send us an email to caribnewsdesk@gmail.com. Thank you for joining us. I'm Dennis Chabrol.